what we do then, we move from the perceptual existence to a higher state of affairs, and that state of affairs she calls constituent units. Right? She classifies as, and actually I'll make it shorter because I don't know how long this will be. She classifies as constituent units. Right? Constituent units. So the idea is, well, what is a constituent unit? Well, think about it. Imagine, and I think the example she gives is the example of furniture in the world, right? She talks quite a bit about the role of furniture, and you know, her example of furniture is neither here nor there. It's more what that idea of the implications of her discussion of furniture have for our understanding. So think about it. If we're talking about constituent units, then we're talking about a representation of sort of a collected idea within the unit, right? We know, for example, that we can talk about the idea of cars, plural, and that this idea of cars represents many different things in the world, and we can go about classifying these things, right? So that our constituent unit, right? Our constituent unit is itself, and we should know this at this point, our constituent unit is itself contingent on our conceptual ability, right? You cannot talk about a constituent unit independent to the particular human being. My conceptual unit is formalized by a recognition that these identifiable entities in the world all share a common attribute or all share a common function. And insofar as they share a common attribute or a common function, I can embody that shared faculty or that shared function in a unit, right? So that this constituent unit is a consequence, CON, of our COGNITIVE. Right? It is a constituent of our cognitive ability, right? So we move from a perceptual existence to a constituent units, right? To the idea of constituent units. This idea of constituent units is a consequence of our cognitive ability, right? I have recognized some objective reality in the world, and obviously this increases, right? I've recognized some objective reality in the world. My recognition of that objective reality allows me to cognize a unit, right? A classification. Put classification here. Classification of objective, right? And it should be plural. It should be realities, but I ran out of space, right? So I recognize an objective reality in the world as a perceptual entity. This that's just a given. It's flooded towards my faculty of perception. I can identify, after it's been given, specific things in the world. I can see cognitively what the shared relationship between these entities are as a consequence of my cognitive ability, and then I can classify, create a taxonomy in which I classify these things, right? So it's a cognitive taxonomic ability, to be technical, right? It's a cognitive system of classification, right? It's a cognitive, to be simple, cognitive system of classification, right? Okay, so we move to constituent units. From constituent units, we move to, for Rand, and this is where it becomes linguistic, right? And the focus of this chapter is sort of the linguistic role in objectivist epistemology, right? To be very technical. So her account is an attempt to discuss the linguistic role, the role of language, and semiotics and so on, which I'll get into in a second, in its relationship to our both epistemological, the stuff that we know, and metaphysical, the stuff that is reality, right? If that made any sense, I hope it did. I'm sorry. Let me say that again. her account of language is important insofar as we attempt to understand how our language relates to our world. That's what she's saying. Insofar as we attempt to understand epistemology, how our language, linguistics, relate to the world, metaphysics, right? And I'll actually write that out real quick. Attempt to understand how our language relates to the world, right? The understanding is the language, as we'll see, will be our semiotics, and the world will be our metaphysics. Our metaphysics. And to be honest with you, even those metaphysics, I'd like to substitute. No, actually, I shouldn't do this because I got to stay true to Rand. But what I would do is get rid of metaphysics and put physics, right? Because physics has supplanted metaphysics. But technically, metaphysics as embodying contemporary physics, I guess. You know, the discipline that describes the world. And we know that metaphysics doesn't do that anymore. It used to. But now it's physics that does that. So to be technical, I would say physics. But physics, metaphysics, doesn't matter. Okay, so this is an attempt to understand how our language relates to the world. And the way that our language relates to the world is through the use of the way that we attempt to understand how our language relates to the world is through the use of symbols, and understanding, a rigorous understanding on the function of symbols. And in this lecture, I'm going to give you a number. Well, do I give a number? I think I might only give one. I can give a number, but I specifically give one example of the use of symbols. I think it's the clearest example. There's a billion examples, but I give an example of what I'm talking about. Right now, I'm just presenting the theory, right? What are we attempting to do? We're attempting to understand how our language relates to the world. Why is that important? Because we recognize that insofar as Rand is constructing an objectivist epistemology, that our language has to relate to the objective fact of the matter. At its very deep sense, at its deepest sense, our language, according to Rand, and the diagram I'm about to put on the board, ultimately has to refer back to the given. If our language doesn't refer back to this given, if our language refers to some other thing, then there's complications in our language, right? There's deficiencies in the meaning that we've ascribed, right? Obviously, all of this is premised on the huge assumption that meaning is important, which it'd be interesting to argue that meaning isn't important. I don't know how you could do that, but all of this is buttressed on the very large assumption, and I think very valid assumption, that meaning is important, right? Okay.